Hello, it's Chino here. If you like aggressive openings, you're in the right place. Today I'd like to look at the Euglund Gambit, which happens after pawn to d4, pawn to e5, and pawn takes e5. I don't think this is a very good gambit, and I'll show you a few lines why. So here black has three moves, so pawn to d6, pawn to f6, and knight to c6. So let's look at a few. Pawn to f6 is not a very good move because white can simply ignore it with pawn to e4. And the point here is if black was to play pawn takes e4, then there's this move, queen to h5 check. And black has to do something about the check. g6 doesn't help because this move, queen takes e5 check, would win a rook. So not a good idea. So after that, after pawn to f6 and e4, black would be best advised to play, well, not to play pawn takes e5, but to play something else, knight to c6, for example. But then here, after something like knight to f3, and an important and instructive moment here is white's not even bothered about recapturing. And because, okay, yeah, even though it's just still slightly be better for white, the point is black would gain a development advantage, so it would have more pieces developed. Yeah, so instead of capturing on f6, this would give black some counterplay, and even though he's a pawn down, would give him some play for the pawn. So instead of capturing the pawn, so if we just go back to the position after knight to c6, a better move for white here is simply knight to f3. And the point is that now, if black was to go pawn takes f5, bishop takes c4, would be a very, 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 very good position for white. And the point is this bishop would make it very difficult for black to castle kingside. And black's going to lose quite a bit of time to get rid of this bishop. Yeah, okay. So that was the f6 line. Just going back to the starting position, we just looked at f6 and why that's better for white. The other try is pawn to d6. Yeah, just trying to, well, expecting white to capture on d6. So the bishop on f8 can develop with tempo. But again, as with the previous line, white should just ignore it and continue to develop and play knight to f3. In a few games I've seen in my database, black's continued knight to c6, just maintaining the tension in the center. But yeah, a simple refutation of this idea is bishop to g5, trying to clarify the position in this side of the board. And after bishop to e7, bishop takes e7, queen takes e7, and now, only now, pawn takes d6. The point being, whichever way black captures on d6, he ends up with an isolated pawn on d6. So this is an advantage for white. I mean, he can target this pawn. So white's not just the pawn up. He also has the advantage that, yeah, this pawn's weak and he can, point all his pieces to gang up on this pawn, yeah, in the game. Okay, so just going back to the starting position of the Euglund Gambit, the most popular of all the different tries on this move is knight to c6. Yeah, I should point out queen to e7 is played sometimes, but it generally transposes to the line we're about to look at. Knight to c6, this is obviously attacking the pawn on e5, but again, this move, knight to f3. And black would usually try queen to e7, attacking this pawn a second time. And now, white can either go bishop to f4, trying to hold on to the pawn, or bishop to g5. It doesn't really matter, because after either of those moves, black usually plays queen to b4 check, and after knight to c3, queen takes b2, obviously threatening to win the knight. But now bishop to d2, and let's just take stock of this position. So materials equal, but black spent a lot of time getting this queen from, yeah, d8 to e7 to b4 check to b2. Equal material, but we can see that queen is usually, this is usually not a very good square for the queen, because as we'll see, black's going to lose time, you know, to make sure this queen doesn't get into danger, and white gets a big lead in development. So the usual continuation here is bishop to b4, threatening to win a piece on c3, but obviously white isn't going to fall for that. And we'll play rook b1. And then here, black's got nothing better than to play queen to a3. But then after knight d5, brilliant move, we see that there's a threat to capture on c7 with check. So threatening the king and the rook in the corner. So if we just follow a game between Alaberga and Valverde Lopez, it's an email game from 2012. In this game, black saw nothing better than to play bishop takes d2 check, and after queen takes d2, and played king to d8 to defend the pawn. Just going back a couple of moves, so going back to that position after knight to d5, it was also possible to play bishop to a5, defending this c7 square. But I think in this position, white would have rook to b5. I mean, the strong threat already is knight takes bishop, and after queen takes, well, queen won't be able to capture back on a5 because of this bishop on d2. So after rook takes bishop, knight would have to capture bishop, and knight takes c7 would also be an advantage for white. So yeah, just going back, in this game, Valverde Lopez, who was playing the black pieces, didn't fancy bishop to a5, rook to b5, and played bishop takes d2 check. But after queen takes d2, and after queen takes d2, played king to d8. Okay, it's still equal material, although white could win, you know, this a2 pawn at any point. But I think the point here is white's just going for, you know, quick development, and the fact that the black king has lost castling rights means that white can afford to lose, you know, a pawn and still end up with a better position. Okay, after this move, rook to d1, obviously the rook was threatened after the queen captured on a2. Queen to a5 was played, trying to exchange queens. So anytime you're up material, it's usually a good idea to try and exchange pieces. But white was having none of it, played pawn to c3. So obviously now, black has to complete development of his pieces. Obviously, f6 is no longer available for the knight. Knight to h6 would be an odd square for the knight, so he played knight g to e7. But then white just continued developing with bishop to e2. Yeah, after bishop to e2, black's in a fair bit of trouble. I mean, how does he complete development? I mean, look at that queen side. Terrible. Absolutely terrible. He played rook to e8, finishing development of the king side, but then, yeah, this queen side, lack of development of the queen side would be telling, as we'll see. And there's castle king side from white, and now we see all of white's pieces have been mobilized, and black's probably got, you know, a couple of moves before he can, yeah, mobilize the rook and the bishop in the corner. Someone, a strong player, once told me, so this is an international master, once told me, a pawn is worth at least 3 tempi. So if you consider white's a pawn down in this position, and it's gonna take black a lot more than 3 moves to get his king into safety and develop his rook and bishop, remember that, then you can safely say white has an advantage in the position. Yeah, so just remember that 1 pawn, 3 tempi. Yeah, it's going to cost black a lot more than 3 moves to get his pieces developed. So white's clearly better in this position. Okay, in the game, black saw nothing better than to play knight takes d5. But then after pawn takes d5, yeah, and white ended up with this imposing pawn center. Obviously, this knight couldn't retreat. He had to recapture an e5, which was probably the point of playing this sequence of moves. Yeah, but the problem with this move is that after queen to g5 check and rook to e7, white regains the pawn with queen takes g7 with some very strong threats. I mean, queen to h8 is on the cards, queen takes h7 is on the cards at some point. In this position, black saw nothing better than to play queen takes c3. But if we just pause for a second, considering the lack of development, a sensible try would have been to maybe try and create an develop a queen side with, say, pawn to b6. But the problem with this is I think it allows a forced mate in 10 moves, starting with something like queen to g8 check, and rook to e8 is the only move, queen to g5 check, and if rook to e7, knight takes e5 and winning material. Notice this rook is pinned to the king, and so on and so forth. So I wouldn't spend too much time on that. So just going back to that position after queen takes g7, yeah, b6 was a tricky one because of this sequence of queen to g8 check, etc., queen to g5, and then subsequently winning this knight. So black saw nothing better than to try queen takes c3, which is a horrible move. I mean, when you're so far behind in development and can't develop your pieces, this is just a bad sign. In this position, well, if I might just add, just going back one move into the queen takes c3, knight takes f3. I mean, I said earlier on, if you're ahead in material, you should probably exchange pieces, but in this position it's not such a good idea because of this lack of development and because of the vulnerability of the king on the back rank. So for example, after bishop takes f3, I mean, black's still in trouble. I mean, what do you play? b6, trying to develop a bishop and develop the queen side would simply be met by rook to e1 when already black's in a lot of trouble. I mean, rook takes e1 is almost forced, but the problem now is black is pretty much getting checkmated after either pawn to bishop to either after bishop to b7 check, queen to f8, or even if we go back, even after pawn to c6 to create an escape square on c7 and d6. Yeah, this is terrible. Okay, so yeah, just going back to the game, to the position after queen takes g7. So yeah, we've just seen pawn to b6 doesn't really work because of this queen to g8 check and queen to g5. Knight takes f3. Exchanges on f3 don't work because of this rook to e1. So yeah, in the game, black saw nothing better than to try queen takes c3. But then after this nice centralizing move by white and d6, we saw this move, queen to h8 check from black. Rook had to cover. I mean, king to d7 would have just been a terrible looking move. Okay, so just going back, so rook to e8 first, but now queen to f6 check, rook to e7 blocking the check, but now simply rook to f to e1. The point being here, now there's a strong threat, to move the bishop away you know, and place some pressure on this file. As we'll see, this culminates in a brilliant sacrifice. Just watching and learn. Bishop to d7, bishop to h5, like we anticipated, putting pressure on this file. And now the last mistake from, I mean, black's already lost in this position. He played pawn to b6. Just going back, it's just worth noting here. I mean, what else can you recommend for black? Pawn to a5, for example, could be met by bishop takes f7. I mean, the rook can't capture the bishop because the rook's pinned to the king. If the knight captures here, there's always this move. Either queen takes e7 or rook takes e7. So yeah, terrible position for black. But yeah, just going back to the position after bishop h5, black played pawn to b6. And here white had a beautiful move to finish the game. See if you can pause the video and see if you can find this. Yeah, give yourself, I don't know, a minute or two to see if you can find the winning move for white. Okay, I trust you either found it or you're waiting for me to show you the answer. Well, the brilliant move here was rook takes e5, exclamation mark, and the point is obviously rook can't capture on e5 because it's pinned to the king. So the only move is pawn takes e5, but then comes knight to c6 check. And in this position, the player of the black pieces, Valverde Lopez, resigned. Yeah, the point here is if the king moves, that that rook falls. The queen can't capture on c6 because the pawn's defending c6. And if bishop takes c6, well, this move, discover check, is going to force checkmate. Whichever way the king goes, king to e8 would be queen to h8 checkmate, and queen to c7 again would be queen to h8 check. Rook blocks, queen takes e8 checkmate. Yeah. So yeah, that was a brilliant game from Albergi Valverde Lopez, and shows how to play against the Euglund Gambit. But yeah, if we recap and look at the starting position after pawn to e5, pawn takes e5, against all of black's tries in this position. So for example, after pawn to f6, yeah, white should play this move, pawn to e4, noting here that pawn takes e5 is impossible because of queen h5 check. I'm winning a pawn. Next move, going back to the starting position after pawn to d6, again white should just play, yeah, knight to f3. Ignore the pawn, don't try and capture a second pawn. And after something like knight to c6, bishop to g5, bishop to e7, exchanges here should favor white because he gets this. Well, he not only ends up a pawn up, but ends up with an isolated pawn to target. And if we go back to the main line, so after pawn takes e5, and after the main line, knight c6, knight f3, queen e7, bishop g5 or bishop f4 gives white an advantage. Yeah, even though white and black temporarily regains his pawn here, and in some lines ends up with an extra pawn. Yeah, the point here is black falls behind in development. Yeah, by too much. So yeah, I also want you to remember that even though you lose material, so in some cases 1 or 2 pawns, you should remember that a pawn is worth 3 tempi, and that's a useful rule of thumb to have in games where you're sacrificing pawns for an initiative. Yeah, so I hope you liked this one. Please don't forget to like, subscribe, and share, and hope to see you on the next one.